Charleston Naval Gala, 1942 hours. The chandeliers burned bright above me as if the night itself wanted to watch. My hand slid against polished marble wet and warm as Linda Steele dragged me through a room that was supposed to honor service and sacrifice. The sound of her heels against the floor was steady, practiced, like she had been waiting years for this exact moment. Her grip on my wrist was iron, the kind born not from strength, but from obsession. My uniform was torn at the elbow, the blood on my hand smeared across the marble like a signature I never agreed to sign. A single shot cracked through the hallway beyond the double doors. The gala froze. Glass trembled. Forks stopped mid-air. Someone whispered my name. I had heard gunfire overseas, but this silence was louder. Linda leaned close. I could smell her perfume sweet and sharp like the mask she always wore. "You should have never crossed me, Mara." Her voice was silk wrapped around a blade. This wasn't fury. This was the sound of someone who believed the room already belonged to her. Officers in dress uniforms turned their heads, but no one moved. That is how power works in rooms like this. It doesn't scream. It waits. My heartbeat stayed even under the blood on my skin. I focused on the ceiling. Calm is not mercy. Calm is the edge of the knife that comes next. The men, pretending to be security, shifted their weight wrong. Their steps were too clean. No Navy training. Mercenaries. The radio on my wrist hissed with faint static. 3 clicks. Not random. A code. A promise. That sound didn't belong to them. It belonged to us. Linda straightened, letting go of me with the elegance of a woman who thought the game was already over. She raised her chin to address the crowd, ready to turn this ballroom into a stage where she'd play hero and I'd be the villain. Flashbulbs burst. Murmurs swelled. The marble beneath me felt colder, but not from the blood. It came from memory. From every winter night she had made me stand on the dock with rope cuts on my hands, calling it discipline. The ceiling blurred, but my mind didn't. Every mission has an entry point. Every betrayal has a timestamp, and hers was marked right here. Another shot echoed from the hallway. Closer. Not panic. Signal. The double doors rattled. A rhythm of boots followed, even trained unmistakable. Not mercenaries. My team. The chandelier light flashed across Linda's bracelet as she turned toward the entrance. She thought the world would end with me on this floor. She didn't know I had already called it in. I felt the blood on my palm tighten as I curled my fist. Calm is a blade, and she had no idea it was already at her throat. I was 10 when Linda Steele walked into my house for the first time. She wore black leather gloves and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Charleston's air in late autumn carried the sharp smell of salt and wood smoke, and I remember thinking that the woman who stood on our porch looked like someone who could split a room in half without raising her voice. My father had been gone for barely 2 months. His Navy uniform, still hung in the hallway closet, still smelled of engine oil and cold air. I stood barefoot on the porch, clutching the railing, listening to the sound of her boots crossing the threshold like it was already hers. She didn't hug me. She didn't bend down. She looked straight at me, measuring the space between us the way people measure territory they plan to own. From that night on, the house changed. The lights dimmed earlier. Laughter, what little there was, disappeared entirely. The kitchen clock ticked louder. Even the air seemed quieter, as if the walls themselves knew something had shifted. She never raised her hand at first. She didn't need to. Control doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives wearing lipstick and perfectly polished shoes. She started with the little things, folding my clothes differently, correcting the way I stood, saying my name like it was a word that needed fixing. The dock behind our house became her training ground. If I tied the rope wrong, she would stand silently beside me, tapping her gloved finger on the wooden rail until I tried again. The rope would dig into my small hands, and I would keep tying and untying until I could no longer feel my fingertips. When the wind came off the water, it cut through the thin fabric of my jacket, but I knew better than to ask to go inside. She didn't believe in inside. She believed in control. She told me that weakness was a luxury only people without enemies could afford. I was a child, but even then I understood that when she said enemies, she didn't mean other people. She meant me. She watched the way I blinked, the way I breathed, the way I failed. She watched, like a person counting points in a game I didn't know I was playing. I learned to keep my posture straight even when my fingers bled. I learned to breathe silently so she wouldn't call it noise. I learned that the difference between discipline and cruelty was only ever defined by the one holding the rope. Winter nights on the dock blurred together. I would stand there 10, 11, 12, the smell of wet rope pressed against my skin while the tide lapped against the wood. She would talk softly about responsibility, about loyalty, about how the world would crush girls like me if I didn't learn how to obey. And behind every soft word there was a blade she didn't need to show. I grew around that blade. I learned to sharpen myself against it. By the time I turned 13, I could tie a cleat knot in the dark with my eyes closed and my hands shaking from the cold. She called it strength. I called it survival. The neighbors saw her as elegant proper, the kind of woman who organized charity galas and quoted Navy speeches like they were scripture. They didn't see the way her eyes followed me through a room. They didn't hear the way silence felt heavier when she entered a doorway. She built an empire of quiet control, brick by brick, moment by moment, and I lived inside it like a soldier standing at attention before I ever put on a uniform. I started to understand something she never meant to teach me. People like her build walls not to keep others out, but to keep their power in. And if I ever wanted to breathe again, I would have to find a way to break through those walls without making a sound. By the time I turned 15, the dock was no longer just a place where she tested me. It had become a battlefield that never needed bullets. Every knot, every silent command, every small humiliation carved something into me. My friends at school talked about weekend trips and birthdays. I talked to the tide. The water didn't answer, but it also didn't lie. Linda would stand behind me during storms, umbrella tilted just enough to keep her dry while I stood soaked through tightening and untying rope in the cold. She never shouted. Shouting would have meant she cared enough to lose control. She preferred to break things with precision. She would glance at the house lights behind us, then at me, and I would know another hour had just been added to whatever lesson she believed I needed. My hands toughened. The pain dulled. My silence became a shield she couldn't quite read. She wanted obedience. What she built instead was a survivor. One night, she made me stand barefoot on the dock until my teeth chattered. She leaned close and whispered that the world belonged to people who didn't flinch. The next morning, she signed me up for a summer military preparatory program without asking me. She didn't do it out of love. She did it because she wanted to build a soldier she could control. But she never understood the flaw in her design. When you teach someone how to endure, you also teach them how to endure without you. At 16, I stepped through the gates of the academy for the first time. The heat rose off the pavement. Drill instructors barked orders. Cadets moved in synchronized lines. It should have felt overwhelming. Instead, it felt like air after years underwater. I had been trained for silence, for cold, for control. This place was loud and alive, but it was honest. When they shouted, they meant it. When they demanded, they gave back discipline, not manipulation. I could breathe here. I learned to run until my legs shook to salute, until the edges of my hand burned to move with people who didn't pretend to love me while waiting for me to break. Every rule they gave me was clear. Every punishment had a purpose. It was brutal, but it was fair. And after years with Linda, fair felt like freedom. I sent no letters home. She didn't send any either. We both understood that the distance between us wasn't measured in miles, but in the fact that she couldn't control what she didn't see. My father's old naval badge stayed in the bottom of my locker, wrapped in the cloth she had tried to throw away. At night, when the barracks were quiet, I would trace the worn edges and remind myself why I was here. I wasn't here to escape her. I was here to build something she couldn't tear down. I pushed through every drill, every sleepless night, every bruise with the quiet fire she had forced into me. She forged the steel. I decided where to point it. One evening during training, the loudspeakers carried the sound of a SEAL unit reciting their oath as they returned from a mission. I stopped mid-step, sweat running down my neck, listening to their voices merge as one. It was steady. Unbreakable. It was everything her voice wasn't. I didn't know then that someday that sound would walk into a ballroom at 1942 hours. I didn't know it would become my signal in the dark. I only knew that for the first time in years, something inside me aligned with the world instead of fighting against it. From that moment on, every obstacle she had built for me turned into a training ground she didn't own. Every scar she left on me became a map pointing toward a future she couldn't reach. I was no longer the girl standing barefoot on the dock. I was the one learning how to command storms. When I returned to Charleston in 2018, the city looked smaller, but Linda Steele looked larger. She had built herself into something polished and dangerous, the kind of figure people nodded to in public even when they did not like her. She wore tailored suits, now carried herself with the calm authority of someone who had been rehearsing power for decades. Her name appeared in local political columns. Her face smiled from charity galas, and the house I grew up in no longer smelled of salt and rope. It smelled like money and control. I had spent years learning how to lead sailors across oceans. She had spent those years learning how to control everyone who stayed behind. She greeted me on the front porch like I was a guest, not her stepdaughter. Her eyes scanned my uniform with the sharpness of someone searching for weakness. She said she was proud. She always said that when she was preparing to strike. Control never disappeared with her. It only changed form. She started by casually asking about my assignments, where I'd be posted next, what systems I worked with, who reported to me. On the surface, it sounded like polite conversation. Underneath, I could feel her measuring what she could still own. She didn't need to shout, she never did. A single raised eyebrow from her had always been enough to remind me how she saw the world. Power was something you held in your fist and never loosened. My father's photograph still hung in the hallway, but his memory had been repainted with her version of him. She told neighbors stories about their life together that had never happened. She wore his medals on a display board as if she had earned them herself. She positioned herself as the widow of a respected officer, the woman who had sacrificed everything for duty, the perfect figure to shake hands with city officials and defense contractors. She didn't say it directly, but I could hear it in every pause. She wanted me to become part of her narrative. She wanted my rank to amplify her power. She began attending military events, always careful to stand just close enough that her presence bled into mine. People saw her beside me and assumed alliance. She loved that. It didn't matter that our conversations ended in silence, or that my jaw locked every time she spoke. To her, image was everything. Control was not always physical. Sometimes it was the ability to rewrite reality until everyone but you believed it. She mastered that art long before I learned how to hold a command. I started to recognize that every invitation she extended, every casual lunch, every gentle question about my duties was another thread she was weaving. She was building a net, and she expected me to walk straight into it. But what she didn't know was that the girl on the dock was long gone. The woman who had returned wore steel under her skin. I kept my face calm and my answers vague. She smiled wider each time I did. She thought silence meant surrender. She never understood it could also mean strategy. The deeper I watched her operate, the more I realized how carefully she had built her reach. It wasn't just the neighborhood or the social circles anymore. She had a presence inside defense contractor events, private fundraisers, even committees that flirted with Pentagon budgets. People underestimated her because she smiled in soft tones and carried a charity ribbon on her lapel. But I had grown up watching her move. I knew what that smile cost. She had a way of making other people feel seen while quietly measuring how much of them she could use. She collected information like other women collected jewelry, and she wore it just as elegantly. She started making suggestions about my career that weren't really suggestions. She asked about postings with access to secure systems, about command-level clearances, about budgets tied to Navy contracts. She wasn't asking because she cared. She was mapping. I began noticing people she introduced me to at these events: contractors, lobbyists, former officials who now spoke with the smooth confidence of men who sold influence for a living. They asked questions that sounded friendly but carried weight beneath the surface. Linda would stand just behind me letting me answer, but making it clear whose stage it was. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like a proud stepmother supporting a decorated officer. To me, it felt like standing on the dock again, hands tied to an invisible rope I hadn't chosen. She no longer used commands. She used expectation, the kind that wrapped around your lungs before you realized you were suffocating. I responded with politeness, careful distance, and a mind already calculating how much of her net I could quietly cut without letting her hear the thread snap. She didn't like resistance. She never had. So when I started limiting what I shared with her, I could feel the air in the room shift. Her smile tightened. Her eyes sharpened. She leaned closer at dinner's lowered her voice reminded me of family obligations that were less about love and more about leverage. She said things like, "You wouldn't want people to think you're ungrateful, and after all, we're family." Words wrapped in velvet but forged from steel. She wanted obedience, not loyalty. When I didn't give it, she adjusted her grip. She reached out to people around me, not me directly. Old friends, colleagues, anyone whose loyalty might be easier to sway. She began showing up at Navy social functions even when I didn't invite her. She didn't need an invitation. She believed everything connected to me belonged to her narrative. At first, the officers didn't see it. They just saw a polished woman with a practiced smile. But I could feel the tightening. Every shared glance, every quiet nod in hallways that used to belong to me alone, now had her fingerprints on them. She wasn't fighting me with fists. She was surrounding me with image. That was always her favorite weapon. And it was harder to fight because no one else could see the cage being built. Not yet. But I could feel each invisible bar sliding into place. By 2023, the quiet pressure she built around me no longer felt like background noise. It became a structure precise and calculated. She began using the media like she once used her voice on the dock, subtle and relentless. Articles appeared in local papers mentioning her as a supporter of national security initiatives, with my name floating nearby in neatly phrased sentences. She never had to claim power. She just placed herself close enough to it so everyone else did the claiming for her. That was her genius. She made other people build her empire without ever asking them to. My image started bending without my consent. Invitations to events I never accepted showed up in my inbox with her name attached as co-host. Photographs of us standing side by side at ceremonies I didn't remember were published online. I saw the pattern. She was attaching herself to every uniform I wore, every salute I gave, every word I spoke, until the line between her reputation and mine blurred in the eyes of everyone watching. She didn't need to own me to control me. She only needed to make the world believe she already did. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking silence might dull the edges. But silence with her had always been a weapon she understood too well. The tighter I kept my distance, the harder she pushed to fill the space. She started appearing at press briefings where she had no reason to be. She shook hands with contractors who were circling our defense systems like sharks. She smiled at the cameras the way she used to smile on the dock when the knots finally gave in. And then she began asking questions about things she should not have known. Details of operations, dates of rotations, schedules that were locked behind clearance walls. She never asked directly. She threaded her curiosity through dinner conversations, through friendly remarks, through the way she tilted her head when I mentioned deployments. That was when the alarms in my mind stopped whispering and started screaming. This wasn't just about image anymore. She was looking for a lever, a way to turn everything I had built into something she could control or sell. She wanted a piece of the power she could never earn, and she was patient enough to take it 1 inch at a time. But what she didn't understand was that my patience was built from colder nights than hers. The girl she had once dragged through winters had learned to play a longer game. I stopped giving her anything. No updates. No hints. Just silence she could not twist. I let her think she was winning because she needed to believe that. She mistook restraint for weakness. But in the military, silence isn't surrender. Silence is planning. And I was already listening to the static on channels she didn't know existed. The Charleston Naval Gala was meant to be a night of polished uniforms, careful speeches, and the kind of applause that never quite reaches anyone's heart. At 1900 hours, the ballroom glimmered with crystal chandeliers and gold-trimmed walls. Every table was set with military precision, every glass in perfect alignment. I stood at the edge of the room, my dress uniform pressed sharp against my shoulders, watching officers and contractors mingle like they were born to trust each other. But beneath the glitter of the evening, there was a rhythm that didn't belong. A tension humming beneath polite conversation as if something in the air had already chosen its side. I felt it the moment my phone vibrated against my wrist. A single encrypted ping. No subject line, no signature. Just a set of numbers that shouldn't have appeared on any unsecured network. It looked like an internal alert, but carried the wrong encryption sequence too clean to be random, too careful to be coincidence. I glanced at the nearest security officer. He didn't even blink. That was the first warning. Linda arrived minutes later. She wore a navy blue gown cut like a weapon. The crowd parted without her asking. She smiled the way predators smile when the hunt has already been decided. She approached me slowly, glass of champagne in hand, not a trace of nervousness in her posture. She greeted officers like a politician, touched hands lightly, and locked eyes with me like she was already watching my walls collapse. When she leaned in to kiss my cheek, her perfume wrapped around me like a trap snapping shut. She whispered just loud enough for only me to hear, "It's going to be a big night." Her smile widened when I didn't respond. She thrived on reaction, and my silence always made her press harder. The master of ceremonies took the stage voice booming through the hall. The gala was to honor active leadership in naval intelligence operations. My name was listed on the program as the final honoree. The applause rose on cue, practiced and hollow. I scanned the exits, the vents, the edges of the room. Military habit. But tonight it felt different. I'd stood in war zones where danger made sense. Here it wore silk gloves. Linda drifted through the crowd like she had built the room herself. She brushed shoulders with men in suits that cost more than some soldiers' yearly salaries. I recognized one of them, a representative from Atlantic Forge, the defense contractor with too many closed-door meetings and not enough transparency. I remembered his face from a secure briefing months earlier, and now he was shaking hands with my stepmother like they shared a language I wasn't supposed to understand. That was the second warning. I kept my breathing steady, but something in the air shifted like a fuse had already been lit somewhere behind the marble walls. The night wasn't going to end with applause. It was going to end with impact, and I could already hear the echo. At 19:15 hours, the encrypted alert pinged again this time with a string of numbers that made my stomach lock. It was a line of coordinates formatted in the exact structure used by Navy command relays, but the signature key belonged to my clearance level. That was impossible. No one outside my terminal could have generated it. A chill moved through my spine, quiet and surgical. I slid my thumb over the watch face and expanded the packet. Someone had spoofed my ID to access an internal defense route. Whoever did it knew the architecture of classified systems, and they wanted the trail to end at me. I scanned the room again. The contractors looked bored, the officers comfortable. Only Linda had that tilt to her head, a fraction of a smile, a look that reminded me of the dock on storm nights when she knew I'd break before I froze. She was waiting for something. A soft burst of static bled through the hidden channel in my earpiece low enough that only trained ears would catch it. 1 click. Pause. 2 clicks. Ethan's code. It meant eyes on. I didn't respond. I kept my body perfectly still. Control is currency in rooms like this. At the podium, the speaker shifted tone. Instead of moving to the next segment, he paused for dramatic effect. Cameras tilted. Officers leaned forward. A thin line of tension ran across the floor like someone had pulled it tight under our feet. Then came the sound of polished shoes entering through the side hallway too crisp to be guests. 2 men in formal suits walked in without hesitation, followed by a third holding a black case. They weren't part of the event. They carried themselves like people who had already been briefed. Linda turned slightly toward them, and for a split second our eyes met. She didn't blink. She didn't need to. The look was enough. I had seen that exact look when she pushed me back onto the dock years ago and said, "Don't flinch." The lights dimmed slightly as the sound system adjusted. A shadow fell across the edge of the ballroom. The men stopped near the stage, scanning the crowd like they were counting chess pieces. A security officer moved toward them, but one of the men produced a document with the clean efficiency of someone who had rehearsed it. The officer stepped back. That was the third warning. I felt every hair on the back of my neck rise. My clearance ID had been used to send a classified packet. My stepmother was smiling in the corner, and 3 strangers carrying authority had just walked into the room with perfect timing. This wasn't coincidence. It was choreography, the kind where I was supposed to be the one standing alone when the lights cut out. I straightened my posture chest, rising slowly. I wasn't the girl on the dock anymore, and whoever was holding the rope tonight was about to learn what it felt like when it snapped. At 19:25 hours, the master of ceremonies invited me to the stage. His voice held a careful rhythm as if he was reading from a script I hadn't been allowed to see. Applause rose polite and uniform. My boots clicked softly against the marble steps as I walked up, every sense pulling tight like a drawn bowstring. I'd stood on countless stages before, under brighter lights and heavier expectations, but none of them carried this weight. The men with the black case positioned themselves near the base of the platform. They didn't move like guests. They moved like the moment was already written. Linda stood near the center of the crowd, head slightly tilted the same way she used to tilt it when I misstepped on the dock. She looked calm, almost proud. That was the tell. She never looked proud of me, only proud of what she owned. The house band stopped mid-piece as the mic popped. The silence was almost deliberate. One of the men stepped forward and whispered something to the announcer. The announcer nodded, cleared his throat, and the next words came out like a hammer. Admiral Mara Steele, you are under investigation for a breach of national security protocols. The sound in the ballroom fractured. Glasses froze in hands. A woman gasped sharply near the back. Cameras flashed fast and chaotic like gunfire without noise. I didn't move. If there's one thing military life teaches you, it's how to hold your ground while the world starts shaking. The second man opened the black case. Inside was a printed document stamped with the kind of red that never means anything good. My name glared back at me in block letters linked to the encrypted coordinates from the forged alert. Someone had built a perfect chain of evidence clean enough to convince anyone who wasn't looking closely, and everyone in that room was about to be told not to look closely. Linda lowered her glass slowly, not to hide, but to savor. She had wanted this moment staged, public, controlled, visible, to make sure there would be no coming back from it. I heard the quiet click in my ear again. Ethan. 2 clicks. 1, pause, 2 clicks. Confirming visual contact. He was somewhere near. That single sound cut through the chaos like a blade through fabric. I looked straight at the lead agent. My voice stayed calm, the kind of calm that unnerves people who expect you to beg. Proceed with your statement, I said. The man hesitated just enough for me to know I'd unsettled him. That was good. Uncertainty is the first crack in a trap. Linda's smile barely moved, but her eyes flicked sideways. She didn't expect me to sound steady. That was her mistake. She had built this moment on the memory of a girl who stood barefoot on a dock. But I was standing on a stage now, and I had no intention of breaking where she thought I would. At 19:35 hours, the air in the ballroom turned sharp. The lead agent unfolded the document with mechanical precision and read the accusation out loud. Every word landed with the weight of a verdict that had already been written. My name, my clearance code, a trail of forged transmissions pointing directly at me. The cameras lining the back wall flared brighter, recording everything, feeding it live to waiting media outside. It wasn't just an accusation. It was a public execution of reputation. 2 uniformed security officers moved in from the right wing. They weren't part of my team. Their boots hit the marble with stiff rhythm 1-2-1-2, like the steps of men sent to collect evidence, not question it. I didn't move. If I stepped back, it would look like fear. If I stepped forward, it would look like resistance. So I stood perfectly still, letting silence settle over the room like a storm cloud too heavy to burst yet. Linda took a slow sip of champagne, eyes on me the entire time. She wasn't celebrating yet. She was savoring the buildup. The announcer handed the mic to the agent, stepping back like this was some scheduled intermission. The agent raised his voice. Admiral Steele, you are to be escorted for immediate questioning under Section 17 of National Defense Protocol. That single line changed everything. Section 17 wasn't a routine measure. It was designed for urgent containment cases where the accused was presumed compromised before they ever spoke. It was the kind of protocol that left no space for explanation. Linda had chosen well. She had set the trap with something that didn't need to be proven before it punished. The officer on my left reached for the cuff clipped to his belt. His movements were practiced smooth, as if he had been told exactly where I'd be standing when this happened. At that precise moment, the static in my earpiece flared again. 1 click. Pause. 3 clicks. That was Ethan. Not eyes on anymore. Action prepping. Somewhere beyond these walls, the wheels were turning. I met the agent's eyes without flinching. He expected panic. What he got was a look that said I had survived worse. That was enough to make his hand tighten around the cuff. Linda shifted her weight slightly, a detail almost invisible to anyone else, but I saw it. She had been waiting years to see me standing under a spotlight with nowhere to run. But she had forgotten something. I didn't need to run. I needed to wait. Every operation has a phase when the trap thinks it's closing. That's when the counterstrike starts breathing. The officer grabbed my wrist. I didn't resist. The metal pressed cold against my skin. The click echoed through the hall louder than it should have. In that moment, I wasn't breaking. I was memorizing every face, every breath, every second. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but the wind was shifting, and she didn't hear it coming. At 1930 hours, Norfolk Command Ops was alive with the kind of quiet that always came before something big. No shouting, no rush, just that deliberate hum of high-level operations where silence carried more weight than noise. The glow of tactical screens lit the room in deep blue as encrypted feeds scrolled down the wall like a pulse. At the far end of the floor, Ethan Graves sat with his headset tilted slightly, one hand hovering over the comm panel. He was built for nights like this, steady as steel. His call sign, Reaper 0, pulsed across the mission board in faint green. He'd been on standby ever since I forwarded my private authentication code months earlier for emergency protocol. When the false alert carrying my clearance hit the system, it reached his station too. The second he decoded the packet, he knew something was wrong. The structure was too clean. No operator inside our network writes like that. He pulled up my last active authentication log and watched it overlap with the forged one like a mirror. Someone was using my name to burn down the house from the inside. The comms crackled softly. Falcon 1, actual authenticate. He tapped twice the response, low and exact. Ethan Command, Ops copy green. Static hissed, then a voice came through female, clipped with control. Central Command confirms Admiral Steele authentication is mismatched by 2 milliseconds. That was enough. In classified operations, 2 milliseconds was a lifetime. That single gap proved the alert was a fake. But by then, the ballroom was already filling with cameras, and Linda was already enjoying the stage she had built. Ethan pushed off the chair, grabbed his mission tablet, and barked an order to his left. Pull Iron Tide Priority 1. Every operator in the room looked up. Operation Iron Tide wasn't standard procedure. It was a mission reserved for situations where internal compromise required extraction and exposure at the same time, not to protect the accused, but to reveal the truth under active pressure. Green lights flashed across the board as SEAL units from Charleston Joint Base received the preliminary ping. They didn't know what they were walking into yet, but Ethan did. He had spent months watching Linda's orbit tighten around my life. He had watched the way contractors from Atlantic Forge drifted too close, and he had been waiting for this exact pattern to break. The commander at the next terminal confirmed. Iron Tide authenticated full clearance. Ethan's jaw tightened. He leaned toward the comms mic. Reaper 0 to Falcon Unit. Stand by for deployment. Target zone Charleston Harbor Ballroom. Copy coordinates. The room shifted in one collective breath. He'd just turned Linda's stage into a battlefield. At 1945 hours, the command center's light panels shifted to red operational mode. Once Iron Tide was authorized, there was no reversing it. The wall displays zoomed into the Charleston grid, overlaying infrared routes and access points. Ethan stood behind the main console, arms folded tight, scanning the feed. His breathing didn't change, but everyone in the room could feel the temperature drop. This wasn't about neutralizing an external threat. This was about peeling away a lie wrapped in my name. A junior officer on his left called out authentication again. Secondary clearance confirmed. 2-millisecond drift holds. Ethan didn't need to smile. The numbers spoke for themselves. The packet that had triggered the accusations was built to frame me perfectly, but whoever forged it had underestimated the depth of military protocol. Every clearance signature carried a shadow key buried inside the metadata, something only visible to Command Ops. That key was still sitting inside Norfolk untouched, which meant the signature tied to me was an imitation, not the original. A clean forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. Ethan tapped the corner of his tablet and the display split into 4 feeds. One was the ballroom. One was a drone orbiting the harbor. 2 were live angles from SEAL transport units already moving. They rolled out fast, no hesitation boots, and gear prepped. Reaper 0 confirm, staging a voice came through his headset, low and clipped. Ethan keyed the mic. Falcon Unit Operation Iron Tide is go. Target zone perimeter is locked. Confirm breach signal on my mark. Over. He shifted to the encrypted intel line and patched in a second feed, the financial trace. Weeks earlier, he'd quietly run background pulls on Linda's connections after too many coincidences piled up. He wasn't wrong. The contractor transfers were real. Money funneled from Atlantic Forge through layers of shell accounts, finally landing on a shadow ledger tied to Linda. The last payment timestamp matched exactly 30 minutes before the gala started. He let that number burn into the screen. One of the senior officers exhaled slowly. That's not just coordination, that's orchestration. Ethan didn't respond. His focus locked onto the SEAL insertion routes moving across Charleston Harbor. 2 boats approached from the east, ground transport from the west, and 2 agents already embedded near the perimeter. A clean pincer, minimal civilian exposure. His headset crackled again. Reaper 0 Command Ops. Final authorization to proceed granted. Ethan's knuckles brushed the comm switch once. Falcon Unit green light. Maintain blackout protocol. When he lifted his eyes again, the mission clock struck 1950 hours. Linda thought she was building a stage. What she didn't know was that the walls around that stage were already closing in. At 1955 hours, Ethan stood at the far end of the operations floor, headset pressed against his ear, eyes fixed on the live drone feed above the Charleston ballroom. From this height, the scene looked elegant, quiet, almost like any other formal event, but beneath the chandeliers, the fault lines were already visible. The agents positioned near the south entrance adjusted their comm-sets, awaiting his mark. The northern perimeter unit confirmed their angles with 2 short clicks. Ethan keyed into the secure frequency. Reaper 0 to Falcon 1, initiate silent advance. No flash, no sound, no disruption until green flare. Over. The response came in low and crisp. Copy, Reaper. We move. Outside, black SUVs rolled into shadowed positions along the harbor road. 2 rib boats slid along the water engines, muted lights, dark. Every inch of the operation had been built on the kind of discipline that doesn't need noise to make its presence known. As the team moved, Ethan opened the classified financial log and watched the final data packet populate. Atlantic Forge had wired Linda the largest transfer yet, less than 2 hours earlier. The note field carried a single line: deliverables confirmed. That was the proof no courtroom could ignore. He didn't need to say it out loud. The commander standing behind him gave a short nod and turned toward the JAG liaison. A warrant packet was already being drafted in real time. By the time Linda lifted her next glass of champagne, her entire network was already mapped in green and red lines. Ethan refocused on the ballroom audio feed. The announcer's voice echoed steady but strained. Cameras clicked like teeth waiting to bite. Linda's voice cut through softly as she played the role of concerned citizen, her rehearsed performance wrapping around the accusation like a silk ribbon. Ethan's jaw clenched. He had known this woman only from a distance, but he had studied her patterns long enough to predict every turn she'd take. She never struck first. She built the stage and waited for someone else to swing the blade. Not tonight. He toggled the encryption key and patched directly into SEAL command. Reaper 0 to Falcon. Execute Phase 1 on my mark. Countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2. The team halted at both entrances, gloved hands on Trigger's boots in perfect rhythm. Ethan stared at the live clock as it hit 2,000 hours. His thumb pressed down. Mark. At that moment, Operation Iron Tide moved from quiet planning to kinetic reality. The ballroom was no longer just a room dressed in gold and silk. It was a trap with its jaws reversing direction, and for the first time, Linda Steele didn't know she wasn't the hunter anymore. She was the mark. At 2,000 hours, the ballroom lights dimmed slightly, just enough to draw every gaze toward the stage. The agent holding the warrant lifted the microphone, his voice steady in that rehearsed government tone meant to sound unquestionable. He began repeating the accusation as the cameras rolled, sealing my humiliation into the public record. Linda stood a few feet away, her hand loosely holding a glass, her posture serene as if the outcome had already been carved in marble. She had built this moment with the patience of a spider. Every flashbulb, every camera angle, every whisper was designed to turn me into the villain. The officers and civilians around us shifted uncomfortably, caught between disbelief and the reflex to follow what looks official. I didn't fight the stillness. I let it build. The metal of the cuff around my wrist bit cold against my skin, a sensation I filed away without flinching. Panic was what she expected, not silence. Silence had always been the one thing she couldn't control. On the far wall, just past the heads of the gawking crowd, a shadow moved behind the double doors. My ears caught the faint rhythm of boots moving in formation. No chatter, no hesitation. Falcon 1 had arrived. The operation clock in my head ticked down with clinical precision. I kept my chin level as the agent gestured for the officers to pull me toward the steps. My boots shifted against the marble, one controlled movement after another, as if I were on a parade ground. That was the thing Linda never understood. She spent her life building cages. I spent mine learning how to move inside them without losing air. The chandeliers flared brighter. The announcer's voice faltered for a fraction of a second as a low vibration rolled through the floor. The sound of synchronized boots hitting pavement outside. The energy in the room changed. Civilians didn't know what it meant, but I did. She didn't hear it yet. She was too wrapped in her own performance to notice the edges of the stage tightening. Someone in the crowd whispered, "What's happening?" The security officers looked at each other. That was the first crack. Linda finally tilted her head, sensing something off. I turned my wrist slightly, and the radio static in my ear clicked once. Ethan's voice came through low, steady, exact. Reaper 0 to Falcon. Phase 2. Go silent. My heartbeat didn't rise. It steadied, because that was the moment I stopped being their defendant and started being their storm. The lights might have belonged to her, but the ground beneath us didn't. At 2,003 hours, the sound outside the ballroom shifted from the soft thrum of distant traffic to something sharper, controlled, deliberate. The first breach team reached the perimeter door in perfect silence, their boots landing on polished stone with the precision of a clock ticking down. Inside, the announcer stumbled over his next line. It was a small thing, a half-second pause. But half a second in a room like this is a lifetime. People felt it, even those who didn't understand it. The agent holding the warrant adjusted his grip. The officers on either side of me stiffened. Linda's smile faltered just enough to betray a flicker of unease. She wasn't used to losing rhythm. She built her life on making others dance to it. She scanned the crowd, probably expecting some kind of interruption from her own people, but it wasn't hers anymore. The ballroom doors trembled once as Falcon 1 signaled ready. Ethan's voice slipped into my ear again like the click of a trigger. Reaper 0 to Falcon. Breach on 3, 2, 1. A faint thud traveled through the floor. Not loud, just enough for every trained military instinct in me to register it like lightning under the skin. The agent closest to me flinched at the sound, though he didn't know why. The chandeliers above swayed ever so slightly from the subtle air displacement as two teams positioned themselves at opposite entrances. The operation was surgical, quiet, controlled. the opposite of Linda's theater. She had always relied on spectacle. She didn't know how to handle something she couldn't see coming. A ripple moved through the crowd as the first door opened in absolute silence, the hinges controlled by gloved hands. No shouting, no commotion. Just black uniforms sliding into the room like the edges of a shadow, swallowing light. Their boots landed in unison. Their hands signaled silently. Civilians turned. Officers stiffened. Cameras struggled to decide where to aim. Linda's eyes finally widened. Not much. Just enough to tell me she recognized what this was. She had built a trap, but someone else had just cut power to her strings. Falcon 1 spread out across the floor with trained ease, splitting the room into clean angles, securing every line of movement before anyone fully understood what they were seeing. The lead SEAL gave a single hand signal toward the stage. The crowd didn't breathe. And for the first time since the accusation began, I felt the weight shift. Not off my shoulders, onto hers. At 26 hours, the ballroom air tightened as if the chandeliers themselves understood something irreversible was unfolding. The SEAL team moved in formation, deliberate, precise, their black uniforms cutting through the gold and white of Linda's perfect stage like ink spilling across paper. The crowd parted without being told. That's what happens when real authority walks into a room built on fake power. Ethan entered last helmet off calm, like a storm that already knows its outcome. His presence wasn't loud, it was final. Linda's head turned sharply toward him, and in that split second, I saw something I had never seen in her eyes before. Not control, not calculation. A flash of fear she didn't know how to mask. Ethan's boots hit the marble with that even cadence I'd known for years. It was the same sound I heard through radio static when he saved men in places too dark for light to reach. He didn't look at her. He looked at me. And then he spoke. "Admiral Steele, we're here." That single line sliced the air in half. The agents holding the warrant hesitated, their entire script unraveling in the silence that followed. The cameras swung violently toward the entrance, searching for context, for control, for anything. But it was gone. The lead SEAL reached for the folder he carried and raised it high enough for the projection unit to catch. A red wax seal glimmered under the lights. Ethan's voice rang out clear, steady-clipped. "Operation Irontide, authorized by Command Ops Norfolk and Joint Base Charleston. All accusations tied to Admiral Steele are void pending classified security breach investigation. Effective immediately, she is under Command Ops protection." The audience erupted in noise, not because they understood every word, but because power had shifted in real time. The agents who had cuffed me stepped back half a pace. Just half. But it was enough. They didn't know who was in charge anymore. That was the beauty of military chain of command. It doesn't shout. It rearranges the room with one sentence. Linda stood frozen near the center table. The glass in her hand tilted slightly, champagne slipping over the rim. The first crack in her performance. For years, she had rehearsed this kind of moment, sculpting it until it gleamed. She just never imagined the lights would turn on her instead. I lifted my chin, letting the room see what she refused to. This wasn't a woman undone. This was an admiral being reclaimed, and she was standing on my stage now, not the other way around. At 2009 hours, the ballroom was no longer hers. It belonged to the weight of the truth standing in front of her. The SEAL team spread in a clean perimeter. Silent, immovable, their presence drawing invisible lines through every inch of the room. The crowd began to shift its gaze the way people do when a story they thought they understood starts breaking apart in real time. Ethan stepped forward and handed the sealed folder to the lead agent who had cuffed me minutes earlier. The man's hands shook just enough to betray the collapse of his certainty. He opened the file slowly, and the color drained from his face. The screen behind the stage flickered on with a live projection transmitting a secure feed from Command Ops Norfolk. A classified log scrolled down, showing the 2-millisecond drift in my forged ID code, a gap so small civilians wouldn't understand it, but every officer in the room did. The agent lowered the papers like someone realizing they'd just walked into the wrong side of history. Ethan raised his voice again. Command Ops has confirmed the breach originated from an external signal bouncing through shell contractors tied to Atlantic Forge. A new file appeared on the screen. Wire transfers, Linda's name, her offshore ledger, the last one timestamped an hour before the gala. The room went silent in a way even Gunfire can't match. Linda's hand trembled as the glass finally slipped from her fingers and shattered against the marble. Cameras zoomed in like vultures, catching the precise second power shifted. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. Her entire empire had just been reduced to numbers and signatures projected on a wall. She tried to speak. Nothing came out. I lifted my wrist. Ethan unclipped the cuff with one smooth motion. The cold metal fell away from my skin, the echo sharp and satisfying. The lead agent cleared his throat voice, stripped of the arrogance it carried before. Admiral Steele, you are released. My boots touched the center of the stage again, but this time not as their defendant. I was exactly what they had tried to erase. The woman standing in her own name. Falcon 1 held position while Command Ops streamed every shred of proof live through secure media relay. There would be no spin, no erasure, no staged redemption for her. This was the kind of exposure that didn't need applause. Linda stumbled back one step, breath catching mask cracking. All the careful years she had spent weaving control into a net just dissolved under the weight of evidence she couldn't rewrite. For the first time in my life, she looked small. And for the first time in hers, I didn't. At 2130 hours, the ballroom that once smelled of polished marble and expensive perfume now carried the weight of legal authority and the faint tang of fear. Linda Steele stood surrounded by military police and JAG officers, her perfect gown stained from the champagne that had splashed when her hand shook. The crowd no longer looked at her the way they had 2 hours ago. Power had shifted with such quiet brutality that even those who had smiled at her earlier now kept their distance. The SEAL team held their formation calm and precise, but their presence alone made the room feel smaller. Ethan stood just off to my left, headset tilted, his eyes fixed on the agents processing the evidence packets on site. Operation Irontide had moved past its breach stage. This was cleanup. The lead JAG officer stepped forward, his voice stripped of ceremony. Linda Steele, you are under arrest for conspiracy against the United States collusion with a foreign defense contractor and interference with a classified security network. His tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. The accusation now belonged to the law, not to whispers. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She just stared at me, her painted calm dissolving one blink at a time. I'd seen that look before when the ropes cut into my palms years ago on the dock. She always believed control was something she could rebuild from silence, but silence wasn't hers anymore. I watched as they guided her hands behind her back and secured the cuffs, the same cold steel I had worn less than an hour earlier. She flinched at the sound of the click. It echoed through the hall the way gunfire does in tight spaces, louder than it really is. The cameras caught everything. This time she wasn't the author of the story. She was the subject. Ethan didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His presence beside me was steady grounding, the weight of a mission done exactly by the book. The crowd began to shift again, their murmurs heavier now, coated with the kind of awe and fear that comes when people watch a carefully constructed lie collapse in public. The lead JAG officer gestured to the MPs. "Take her in." Linda straightened her spine like she used to when she wanted to make me believe nothing could touch her. But even that posture cracked when they led her past the giant projection still showing the financial trail she couldn't erase. Her empire had been built on image, and image, once shattered, cuts the hands of the one who tries to pick it up again. She turned her head toward me once as they walked her out. Her mouth opened. No words followed. Not this time. At 2140 hours, the convoy moved out from the Charleston ballroom under tight escort. The street outside was lined with flashing lights, but not the chaotic kind. This was controlled power military precision draped in cold authority. Linda was loaded into the center vehicle, hands cuffed her head, tilted forward the way people do when they finally understand the world is no longer bending in their favor. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't lift her chin. For someone who had built an entire existence on performance, the silence around her was louder than any scandal headline. Ethan walked alongside me toward the staging zone, his pace-steady eyes scanning for operational clearance. Falcon 1 was already dispersing into their post-action pattern quiet as ever. They weren't the kind of unit that celebrated. Their work was exposure, not applause. The reporters who had once been summoned to cover a gala now scrambled for a new angle. Their cameras clicked furiously, but this time the light belonged to the truth, not her performance. The JAG transport vehicles pulled away, engines low and controlled. Inside the lead SUV, the evidence crates were locked under chain of custody. No leaks, no second chances. Linda's network was already unraveling. Before the convoy even reached the gate, warrants had gone out to her financial intermediaries, her contractors, and the shadow accounts she thought were invisible. She'd spent decades learning how to build power, but she'd never faced a system that could dismantle it faster than she could lie. The crowd of civilians and officers that had gathered outside shifted, their whispers trailing behind like wind against steel. Some still looked stunned. Others, the ones who knew how deep she had buried her hooks into the system, looked almost relieved. That's what happens when someone who has quietly held the room in fear finally falls. The air itself gets lighter. Ethan slowed his pace as we reached the command transport, his voice low enough only I could hear. Irontide was clean. No civilian injuries. JAG has full control. I nodded once. The words didn't need decoration. They were a mission debrief wrapped in quiet victory. A young officer approached and saluted, eyes sharp but clearly shaken by the speed of what had unfolded. Admiral Steele Command Ops reports secondary warrants are in motion. Linda Steele's offshore assets have been frozen. The weight of that sentence wasn't just legal, it was poetic. The woman who once dragged me across marble floors to humiliate me now sat handcuffed while everything she'd stolen, built, or manipulated was stripped away one account at a time. It wasn't rage I felt. It was precision. I turned toward the harbor, letting the cold air settle on my skin. The storm was still clearing, but the wind was finally mine again. At 2200 hours, the convoy rolled through the secure checkpoint at Joint Base Charleston. Linda was escorted inside the processing wing under full military custody, her heels scraping against the floor in uneven rhythm. Gone was the perfectly choreographed grace she used to dominate rooms. Now she moved like someone dragging the weight of a broken empire. The corridors were sterile and cold, the kind that didn't care who you were outside the gates. She was fingerprinted, scanned, and logged by officers who never looked her in the eye, not out of respect, but because to them she was already a case file. Her entire life she'd built power through being seen. Now the system stripped her of that stage inch by inch. Outside the processing wing, a line of black government vehicles idled while JAG officials reviewed digital evidence packets already submitted by Command Ops Norfolk. Ethan leaned against the side of the transport headset around his neck, the mission tablet still glowing in his hand. Every transfer, every encrypted transaction, every forged packet carrying my ID had already been authenticated and secured. She didn't just lose control. She'd been disassembled with military precision. JAG prosecutors moved fast. Their statements were drafted and transmitted to the federal task force within the hour. A separate internal audit had already begun pulling apart the contractor networks she had relied on to build her leverage. It wasn't just her being taken down. It was the web she had spent decades weaving. I watched from the edge of the loading zone as two officers led her past the security door. She looked up, once eyes scanning for some kind of lifeline in the faces around her. None came. The people who had once laughed at her galas, who let her orbit their influence, now pretended not to see her. Power that comes from manipulation always evaporates fastest when the light hits it. Ethan stepped beside me. Command Ops just confirmed her communications network is dark. They've cut everything. I nodded slowly, letting that truth settle. There had been a time when I believed breaking her control would take years. But control built on shadows doesn't need to be crushed. It only needs the light. She turned her head slightly as they guided her through the door, just enough for our eyes to meet. For the first time in my life, I saw something raw beneath the layers she wore. Not rage, not calculation, just fear. It wasn't satisfying. It was silent, clean, final. Ethan glanced at the time. Iron Tide is officially closed. I exhaled slowly, the night air cold against my skin. For years, she had been the storm that shaped my life. Now she was just another line in an arrest log. At 22:30 hours, the processing wing fell silent except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. The paperwork was done, the chain of custody locked, and Linda sat alone in an interrogation room with a single observation window. She had spent her life performing for every surface that reflected her power. This one gave nothing back. No audience, no allies, just a blank wall and a table that didn't care who she used to be. Outside, the glass JAG officers reviewed statements while Command Ops finalized the evidence transfer to federal channels. Ethan stood beside me, his uniform still bearing the creases of the operation, his voice low. "She's done, Mara." The way he said it wasn't triumphant. It was final, clean. Military victories don't come with celebration. They come with silence. I watched her through the glass shoulder's rigid chin slightly raised. Even now she tried to wear control like a shield, but her eyes kept darting toward the door, searching for the power she no longer owned. I'd imagined this moment countless times. I thought it would burn hot, but it didn't. It felt like cold water closing over the last piece of a storm. The JAG commander stepped out of the side room, folder in hand. Charges confirmed. Collusion, espionage, fraud. All stacked with evidence strong enough to crack every defense she'd built. Her name would no longer echo in the halls she once dominated. It would be cataloged, numbered, filed away. I leaned against the wall, letting the chill of the corridor seep into my skin. Ethan adjusted his comms and checked his watch. "Command Ops has completed the handoff to federal security. Atlantic Forge board members are already in custody. Her entire network is burning down in real time." The corner of his mouth tightened, not in a smile, but in something quieter. Mission complete. I exhaled slowly, my breath steady, not shaking. For so long, she'd been the architecture of my life, the shadow I had to learn to breathe around. And now she was just a woman in a silent room stripped of the myth she built. A JAG officer opened the door to escort me for a final statement. I glanced through the glass one more time. She didn't look up. That was all the closure I needed. I walked away without a word. Behind me, the door sealed with a click that sounded exactly like the end of something I had carried for far too long. The storm wasn't loud anymore. It didn't have to be. It was over. At 1,000 hours 3 days later, the Charleston harbor breeze carried the kind of quiet only a city knows after a storm has passed. Flags along the Memorial Plaza moved softly in the wind, their edges catching sunlight in long, slow arcs. The formal hearing had concluded an hour earlier at Joint Base Charleston. Linda's case had been transferred under federal security oversight, and her name, once spoken with practiced reverence in social circles, was now attached to legal language that left no room for performance. The streets outside the base were lined with reporters, but their energy had shifted. They weren't chasing her anymore. They were waiting for a statement from Command Ops. But none came. The silence itself was the statement. That's how justice sometimes arrives, not with applause, but with the slow weight of truth settling into the world. I walked through the plaza in my service dress uniform, not for ceremony, but because I needed to feel the ground beneath my boots without a spotlight. My palm brushed against the railing overlooking the harbor. Years ago, I had stood here as a girl, tying rope until my hands bled because she told me obedience was survival. Now the same wind touched my face, and there was no rope, no dock, no one pulling the strings except the air itself. A group of cadets marched past the far end of the plaza, their cadence clean and sharp. It reminded me of the night of the gala, the moment when Ethan's team crossed the ballroom threshold with that same measured rhythm. That sound had changed everything. A JAG officer passed by and offered a crisp salute. I returned it automatically, the gesture carrying a different kind of weight now. Not defiance, not anger, just steadiness. When someone builds their power on fear, their collapse doesn't leave noise behind. It leaves space. I breathed it in slowly, letting the salt air fill the quiet corners of my chest. For years, I had lived inside the architecture of her control. She had written the script to set the stage and forced me to play a role I never agreed to. But this silence was mine. It wasn't warm. It wasn't cold. It was clean. I watched the harbor water shift beneath the sun and thought of the girl on the dock, the one who learned how to tie knots, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. She didn't know then that one day those knots would unravel themselves in a courtroom on a stage under the weight of the truth she never needed to scream. At 10:30 hours, I walked along the seawall that framed the harbor, the same stretch where my father once tied his boat, where Linda once watched me fail until I learned to endure. The water lapped softly against the concrete, the sound steady, indifferent, honest. Charleston carried on like nothing had happened, but everything inside me recognized the shift. Power had moved. The air no longer carried her shape. I could breathe without feeling the weight of her shadow in the corners of my lungs. Reporters crowded the far end of the plaza, their microphones angled toward anyone who might offer a statement, but the Navy had made its decision early that morning. There would be no interviews, no dramatic press conferences. The operation had spoken for itself. Ethan approached quietly, hands tucked into the pockets of his flight jacket, his steps matching the rhythm of the water. He didn't need to say much. Men like him understood silence better than words. He stopped beside me, leaning against the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's strange," he said finally, "how quiet victory actually is." I glanced at him, the breeze brushing against my face. "I don't think it's victory. It's something heavier. It's the sound of the truth finally having space to breathe." He nodded slowly, not as an answer, but as someone who understood exactly what that meant. Down on the dock, a group of young cadets prepared a training vessel, their movements disciplined, but full of the clumsy hope that only comes before the first real mission. I recognized myself in them. The girl who once tied knots with shaking hands had turned into the woman standing here watching without fear. For years, everything in my life had revolved around what Linda wanted me to be. She had built a narrative and forced me inside it like a cage. But narratives built on control collapse when truth stands without blinking. She was gone now, not physically, but in the only way that mattered. Her name had been stripped from the rooms she once owned. Her voice, once echoing like a rule, was now just a piece of evidence inside a classified file. Ethan crossed his arms loosely. "They'll try to make sense of it," he said. "They'll write headlines, pull quotes, maybe even make a documentary someday." I exhaled steady. "Let them. For once, it won't be her version they tell." The harbor wind picked up, scattering the morning sun across the water. It felt like exhaling after years of holding my breath. Justice didn't roar. It whispered. And that whisper was enough. At 1100 hours, the Memorial Plaza began to fill with quiet footsteps. Veterans in worn jackets stood beside younger sailors in polished boots, their eyes fixed not on any speech or camera, but on the flag that fluttered high above the harbor. This wasn't an official ceremony. It didn't need to be. Some moments don't require a schedule. They just draw people who understand what it means to survive storms. I stood near the railing, hands behind my back, letting the soft hum of the wind fold around the silence. The world didn't cheer when Linda fell. It simply adjusted. Her name disappeared from the lists she once fought to control. Her invitations vanished. Her calls stopped being answered. Power built on fear doesn't crumble with fire. It fades like fog when the sun hits it. I glanced down the path and saw Ethan approaching. His uniform was clean, but his shoulders carried the quiet weight of someone who'd been up all night finalizing mission reports. He stopped a few feet from me, offering a simple nod. No words, no congratulations. He understood what this day meant. It wasn't victory. It was breathing after years of holding my lungs still. I'd lived my entire life with her voice echoing in corners I couldn't escape. Now there was only the sound of water. Ethan leaned on the railing beside me, eyes tracking the movement of gulls over the harbor. "Command Ops sent the final briefing," he said quietly. "Her network's fully dismantled. Forge contracts dissolved. Senate oversight starts next week." I felt the wind shift against my face. Good. It didn't sound like celebration. It sounded like air. That's what justice really is. Sometimes heavy, unspectacular, but real. I thought of the girl she used to drag across cold docks, the knots, the bruised hands, the silence. That silence had once belonged to her. Now it belonged to me. Veterans in the plaza raised their hands in quiet salutes as the flag was lowered for midday rotation. No speeches, no headlines, just ritual. Ethan didn't break the silence. Neither did I. Because some truths don't need to be spoken out loud to exist. They stand on their own. And when they do, they don't need applause. They just need time to breathe. At 11:30 hours, the harbor was almost empty. The crowd at the plaza had thinned, leaving only the quiet rhythm of boots and the rustle of flags in the breeze. The storm that began with blood on marble floors and a forged code had ended not with applause, but with a silence that reached deeper than any headline ever could. I stood alone at the railing, watching the sunlight play across the water. The same harbor that once held the echoes of Linda's control now felt wide open, clean, unclaimed. My hands rested lightly on the cold iron rail, steady in a way they hadn't been in years. I could still see flashes of that night in my head, the cuffs, the spotlight, her whisper, the click of Ethan's radio, but they no longer carried weight. They were just sounds from a past that no longer had power over me. Behind me, Ethan's footsteps approached unhurried. He didn't speak right away. He never needed to fill silence with noise. We both knew what had been lost and what had been reclaimed. He stopped a few steps away, his shadow stretching over the stone. "It's done," he said simply. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the water. She used to own every corner of my life. Now she doesn't even own her name. Ethan exhaled the sound low, almost lost in the wind. "They'll tell this story 100 different ways, Mara. But I'll remember the silence." I turned then, meeting his eyes. "Reaper, Zero," I said softly, not as a call sign, but as a reminder of the night he walked through that ballroom with a SEAL unit behind him and a folder that broke her empire. His jaw tightened, but his eyes stayed steady. "That's all the thanks I need, Admiral." The gulls circled above us, their calls sharp and clean against the still air. I thought about the years she spent convincing everyone that control was the same as love, that power was the same as truth. She'd built an empire out of fear. But fear can't survive when truth refuses to kneel. I let the wind fill my lungs, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't hurt. Justice doesn't roar. It stands quietly. It lets people breathe. It lets time move forward. I turned away from the harbor, slowly leaving the water behind me. My boots met the stone path with quiet, even steps. No marching band, no headlines, just the soft weight of a story finally ending. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't since I was 10 years old. I felt free.